I fear that the worst is possible, and I fear that we're not as prepared for the worst as we could or should be.
So will he or won't he? It's January 31st, and on the eve of slapping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, Donald Trump is sending mixed messages on whether that surtax is going to apply to Canadian oil. And meanwhile, Ottawa is working on its retaliation and response, and the response might look a lot like a pandemic-style bailout. And speaking of pandemic flashbacks, we got Alberta's COVID task force report coming out, stirring up old debates on masking, social distancing, and vaccines. Joining us this week to talk about it is Conservative Policy Advisor Ken Boessenkool, former Alberta NDP Cabinet Minister Shannon Phillips, and later on, Jackie Forrest from the ARC Energy Research Institute. I'm Jason Markusoff, and welcome to West of Centre. So, Ken and Shannon, you're co-workers now. Funny how policy advisory and consulting makes funny bedmates?
It's a Lethbridge-based firm. My hometown and Shannon's adopted hometown.
Well, we look forward to this mix of discord and agreement. So and with that, let's get off the tariff treadmill because we've been on it forever. And let's talk about something else, something lighter. COVID response. And I'm not sure the province wanted to talk about it, though, because this Gary Davidson's report on COVID response came out late Friday with no press release, no fanfare, just people stumbled upon it, really. COVID response skeptics were urging the province to adopt its proposals on masking, emergency management, and stopping vaccines for youth. Doctor groups are furious, and the Premier says she's keen to review all its ideas. Go to you first, Ken. What was Danielle Smith trying to achieve with this, do you think?
Look, she's leading a government that never sees a problem they can't throw a Crown Corporation at. She's delayed her tax cuts. She's, instead of one health bureaucracy, she's creating three. She's musing about nationalizing auto insurance. This is a government that would make the NDP blush in how left-wing it is. And yet she got 91% in her recent leadership vote by the party members. Why is that? Well, she may be fiscally liberal, but she's socially conspiratorial. That's the party she leads. And these are the people who are giving her 91%, and they could care less whether we have nationalized auto insurance, whether we have more Crown corporations, whether we have higher spending. All they care about is flashing back to conspiratorial ideas around COVID. So she's keeping them happy.
Do you think that Shannon, do you think that she's going to try to navigate this to please her base this time, or is there more at play here?
I think absolutely. This is what she sees as a safe space. Otherwise, she would not have gone out when she was talking about the Heritage Fund and put more fuel on the fire of this report. She would have said something to the effect of, we will review it, and moved on. Instead, she went straight at defending this report, characterizing it as contrarian views, and providing us all with a completely inaccurate assessment of what science is. So these are deeply held views for Danielle Smith. It is politically fraught territory for her, despite the cohesion with her own base. It is not cohesion among broader Albertans and how voters view her. It is dangerous territory to be walking into, not just for the COVID conspiracies, but also the overall management of healthcare and what that raises in the mind of the electorate. So it's a great opportunity for the opposition, certainly. And while it's a good base strategy, it's not a good growth strategy.
And to that point, Ken, she already got it. You were saying that 91% leadership review. And she's not going to face them again before the next election. Does she need to give them more red meat on this?
Well, you remember there's been very few premiers in Alberta that have lasted their full term because party members in Alberta are grab a piece of flesh while they can kind of members. And so Jason Kenney was taken out by these same members. And I think if they think they can take her out, they'll take her out. So she has to keep tending to this base, even if she's putting the health of Albertans at serious risk if she follows through on these recommendations. These are dangerous recommendations. We had a recent death in the U.S. from H5N1. God forbid the bird flu jumps different species. But if we have another pandemic in Alberta and they follow these recommendations, we are going to be in deep, deep trouble.
Do you think, Shannon, that what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is now coming in as a health secretary, likely, based on the confirmation vote, He's quite anti-vaccine, quite notoriously. Danielle Smith has expressed a lot of skepticism. This report has a lot of the same language we've seen to justify vaccine crackdowns in places like Florida. Do you think that that's going to change the calculus somewhat for her, that there is this more vocal voice now in Washington and the States potentially pushing against the vaccine orthodoxy in science?
There is a reason why I increased my voting margin in 2023, my margin of success in the 2023 election. There is a reason why the NDP won most of the seats in Calgary. And there were really two reasons. The economy was performing relatively well. So it wasn't that. It was Danielle Smith's character and it was healthcare. We heard it over and over and over again, and the NDP exploited those weaknesses and performed quite well in that election. So this is not good overall territory for Danielle Smith in terms of the politics. And so the more she goes down the actual health policy implications of this report, the more she finds herself offside of the electorate. It's an open question on what this means for health policy. It's an opportunity, certainly for the opposition, because you need to remember that having access to free and basic public health care is a policy that actually predates Medicare. We started vaccinating for smallpox in the 1800s before Confederation, let alone Medicare, and it was free. The polio vaccine campaign was essentially wrapped up by the time we had Medicare in the 1960s. It was free, it was accessible, it is a basic public health measure predicated on really known science. Taking that away from the electorate would be a very, very daring, very bold and very dangerous strategy, not just for people's overall public health, but for Danielle Smith's electoral prospects. It is exploiting the one weakness she has and the one weakness that Conservatives have right now, which is healthcare.
So she's going to do it, Ken? Do you expect her to actually crack down on vaccines? What she said in the past and before this report came out was that she believes in vaccine choice. Banning would take away the choice.
Look, I got my latest booster for COVID, and I was delayed in getting that booster because of some weird things that she was doing in the bureaucracy. She delayed allowing people to get those boosters by a short period of time in some of the pharmacies. And I just think she'll keep doing these little things around this issue to please her base. The real question is, if we have another pandemic, will she actually follow through? And I think Albertans would rise up in revolt if she said, well, I'm not going to make a vaccine available to the broad population. So I think she'll continue to do irritating little things, but at the end of the day, Albertans wouldn't stand for a conspiracy theory running public policy and public health policy during an actual pandemic.
The other dimension is not just with the public, but there's also the health establishment, the healthcare sector. Danielle Smith is trying to, Shannon, work really hard to reform. She has this breaking up AHS into 4 pillars, trying to work more with doctors, nurse practitioners and whatnot. And this report relied on a few doctors, and some of them who've been sanctioned for their advocacy and, questionable beliefs or controversial beliefs on COVID. And then on the other side, you have the Alberta Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association, dozens of doctors and scientists and epidemiological specialists pushing back on this, saying it's vaccines and discrimination. So, Shannon, what's this going to do on the UCP's relationship with the medical system and doctors?
Well, look, it was already fraught. All of this instability in the healthcare system has certainly not built trust at all with healthcare professionals. And for me, I don't even want to comment on the so-called merits of this report. We've heard from the experts on it. It has been roundly dismissed and criticized. It's kind of dangerous to give the public the impression that 2 centuries of scientific method is equivalent to a few guys yelling at each other on YouTube. It is not. They are not equivalent. This is not 2 bodies of competing knowledge in any way, shape, or form. And so what the policy implications are of all of this instability in the healthcare system is that there is broken trust. It is tough to recruit people. It is tough to keep them here once you have. BC, I know that things aren't amazing in BC. They're not amazing anywhere with respect to healthcare in the post-COVID era, but BC is mowing Alberta's lawn on physician attraction and retention. That is a fact. And why would you? want to continue to practice medicine in this province where you are not respected, and even your basic interpretation of reality is being challenged by a group of people running the place who are not part of the reality-based community.
So you don't want to talk to the report. I read most of it, and, well, I'll say I lived to tell the story. The government, though, and you guys are both in government, so what do you read into the fact that this report was no press release on the Friday afternoon, quietly put on the Open Alberta website on a week where everybody's talking about Trump and Washington, Danielle Smith? Ken?
I would be stunned if it didn't land in the inboxes of party members in numbers of ridings. I would be stunned if it didn't get sent to people that they know through their party database are concerned about primarily this issue. So I'm sure it was communicated discreetly to the people that they wanted to see it. And like Shannon and I have been saying through this whole conversation, this is not mainstream. This is not even normal. Like if I want to decide whether I should get a vaccine or not, I'm going to see my doctor. And the doctors in Alberta have spoken. This is not a report that they can support. And so I think they did that on purpose. This is not a mainstream report. This report was generated for a small group of people, many of whom have memberships in the UCP.
I was listening, Shannon, to some of the chatter on some of the social groups and videos that this group posts, and they're actually a bit troubled by the fact that this was put out quietly, that the government wasn't standing up with this. When the Preston Manning's report on COVID emergency management came out, they put out a press release. They didn't make Manning available for interviews, but they were talking more openly about this. What does the quiet release on a Friday afternoon say to you?
Well, that they understand, to Ken's point, that this is a base strategy. And that's smart on the part of the UCP. And now it is a matter of politics and a matter for the opposition to actually highlight this report, to do what the further right base of Danielle Smith's party actually wants to do, which is, sure, let's talk about it. There are a lot of really, really tough political conversations around health policy and healthcare system manageability and healthcare system availability that are severe pain points for the UCP. The economy is still chugging along in Alberta. There are few, even though things like average weekly earnings and those sort of things are slipping in Alberta and things have become more expensive for people, the fact of the matter is that the main pain point is having to take your kid to an emergency room, as one of my friends did last week, and spend 20 hours waiting with a case of atypical pneumonia in a child. That is the main vulnerability of the government, and that is the question for politics, and that is a question that Danielle Smith is going to have a hard time keeping her caucus together on. It was a problem for Jason Kenney, and it can be a problem for her as well.
But do you think that, I mean, certainly the base is still into this. They are still talking about COVID stuff and vaccine information and disinformation and whatnot. 5 years on, a lot of the public has moved on. Do you think that this is still going to land with the same intensity, Shannon, stay with you, that it would have, say, in 2022? Like,
well, no.
Was still at the edge?
And that's why it has to be linked to the broader healthcare system, right? Because that is top of mind for voters, both those who work in or adjacent to public healthcare and those who have to use it. And that is the main point of weakness in raising this again. Right. The weaknesses that emerged for Jason Kenney weren't just the internecine battles within his caucus around vaccines and mandates and so on and so forth. It was also the imminent collapse of the intensive care system that really put the public pressure on. And that is the piece that those weaknesses remain. And those were many of the motivating factors for how people chose to mark their ballots in the 2023 campaign. And it is a major point of advantage for the opposition. And so that's where the link has to be made. It's not necessarily to go back and fight about masks when and if and whether you had to have a vaccine card or any of these other old things that are now 3 to 5 years old.
Ken?
Look, this report not getting broad public attention for this government is a feature, not a bug. Like this is what they want. They want their narrow base, who voted 91% in favor of Danielle Smith's leadership, to know about this report, and they hope the public won't. That's the strategy, and that's why it was done the way it was done.
Okay, so I know how to pick palate cleanser topics, don't I? Let's talk about tariffs, shall we? But first, let me just check with the control room. Are there tariffs yet? We're okay, guys. No tariffs yet. No tariffs yet. So, Danielle Smith's back from Washington, and she's been sort of stuffing the suggestion box with ideas on how we could satisfy Trump on border security, calling for a Canada border czar, which may or may not have been an idea whispered by Ottawa first. She's talking now joint NORAD military base in the north. She's invited, apparently, Fox News to watch sheriffs operate on their border with Montana. Ken, is this the right tactic to take?
Jason, I'm going to take a step back a bit because I listened to Howard Lutnick's confirmation hearing, and there's this debate, which speaks to your question. There's this debate in Canada about whether this is a negotiating strategy on the part of Trump or whether he intends to put tariffs on Canada structurally and use the revenue to pay for tax cuts. In other words, are these tariffs a negotiating strategy or are they a permanent feature of Canada-US politics? What I heard from Lutnick is that they intend to do both, that they intend tomorrow to impose tariffs or the threat of tariffs in order to get Canada to do a whole bunch of things. And then in April, they will get a report that will tell them that on economic grounds, which I think are specious, but they've made some economic arguments, they're going to put tariffs on Canadian goods to move manufacturing to the United States, to deal with unfair trade practices. And so in the short term, they're negotiating. And then when we give them everything they want, they're going to impose tariffs anyway. So I think the question for Canada is not should we negotiate or should we not negotiate? The question for Canada is, how do we hope for the best and plan for the worst? How do we make sure that after we've done everything between February 1st and April 1st, they don't turn around and put tariffs on anyway? And I think the best answer I can give to that is we should get to the table and negotiate or renegotiate the USMCA, the trade agreement that we had. Let's get to the table and do a comprehensive agreement. Let's not do these things piecemeal. Let's not trust Donald Trump. Like I sometimes think Donald Trump goes to bed surprised at the things he did that day because they were not the things he thought he was going to do when he woke up in the morning. And so like this is not someone that we can trust. This is not someone who keeps his word. This is not someone who you can listen to and follow up and follow what he says as to what he's going to do. And so we can only hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Look, I'm not saying there's a 100% chance he's going to do tariffs forever, but I think there's a 25% chance or a 50% chance that in 4 years, we are going to have massive U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods and a massive U.S. personal corporate tax cut that is going to be funded from the revenues from those goods, and that the Democrats, even if they form the White House, will have a difficult time unwinding those. That is a real possibility, and we should negotiate with that possibility in mind, and I'm sorry for going on so long.
How do we what do you think of Smith's attempts, Shannon, to deal with the February 1st deadline, right in the point? As Ken said, the Commerce Secretary incoming has talked about, if they do it, there will be no tariff. If they don't, there will be. He's talking about the fentanyl, trying to crack down on fentanyl, even though it's not a huge issue for Canada, and immigration. You're seeing what Danielle Smith's doing. Trudeau has also been, talking about beefing up border security, trying to send videos to Washington of Black Hawk helicopters descending into the Canadian snow. Do you think that we're going to be able to appease Trump? Should we try to appease Trump on those fronts, Shannon?
Well, look, what you have to do here is continue negotiating while you can essentially give some things that you were maybe going to do anyway, but are low cost for you to do. That is to say, some of this border stuff, maybe the defense spending plan, those kinds of things. This notion that he can be appeased, though, it's interesting that we use that word, is, to Ken's point, absolutely bananas. He is going to keep moving the goalposts as he goes along because, as Ken says, it is a matter of fiscal policy. There is a change in fiscal policy coming from the United States, which is to say that they are going to get this revenue from tariffs so that they can turn around and cut taxes for rich people on the other side. That is the goal here. So knowing that, understanding that, the job for Canada is to minimize the harm on our country. Does that mean that it probably will result in some disruption of our supply chain from China as there's more of a focus on China. If we can keep the heat off us, yes, it does. But it does mean that we are then protecting our interests and our trading relationships. That has to be the focus for Canadians. And, but so this idea that we can stop him in some way is not realistic. Mr. Trump does not care if his tariffs harm American consumers or companies because, and also he hasn't imposed them yet. They are threats. And so what we have to do is understand that they are threats and be strong in response. If he believes he can raise his government revenue off us, then he will continue to do that thing. What we need to make sure that we are communicating is that he won't be able to do it off us. Go look somewhere else.
Ken, the interesting thing, I was looking at this yesterday. Americans in poll after poll after poll say they don't want this. Businesses don't want this. They expect this to cause price increases in gasoline and everything else. We'll talk about gasoline in a little bit. But why is he doing this even if Americans, and a lot of Republicans, not all, but a lot of Republicans, especially in leadership, don't want this?
Look, Trevor Toome, frequent guest of this pod, has said in the past week or written in the past week or two that Canadian trade with the United States is 3 to 5% of their GDP, and it's 1/3 of our GDP. So if he can put tariffs on Canada and use the revenue from those tariffs to cut taxes for the people who are impacted, cut corporate and personal income taxes to protect those people, it's possible that the Americans won't really feel much effect at all. And we will get kicked in the teeth because trade with the U.S. is such a much bigger part of our economic reality than it is of theirs. And again, this is a simple reality we need to face when we're negotiating, because this hurts us no matter how it happens. This will hurt us a lot more than it hurts them. And that's the danger of the negotiating strategy, because we can negotiate, and then he puts the tariffs on anyway, as I said before, as part of a revenue strategy, and because the pain in the United States will be much smaller than the pain in Canada.
So, and I want to pick a little bit at what Ken just said, because this is where I depart, I think, a little bit from what I've heard in sort of the punditocracy over the last couple of weeks. Those are good macroeconomic arguments, but they miss the politics of this, and they miss the trade, the inherent nature of trade negotiations. Trade policy is a repeated game. If we're thinking about this in terms of game theory, both sides have to think about how their actions incentivize their opponents today, but how those actions communicate future intentions. There was a trade policy expert, Kevin Yin, who was writing about this in the Globe and Mail this week. And I thought it was so compelling that I wrote it down. So Canada cannot signal that it can be bullied by Mr. Trump. We cannot be saying that the economic policy of this country becomes predicated on raising revenue for Mr. Trump. They cannot learn that we are pushovers and that we will not retaliate. They are the bullies who are pushing us into the lockers in high school, but they'll soon notice that we are actually the dweebs trying to fit ourselves into the locker as they walk down the hallway. And that is a question for politics. And on this, I would tar the whole sort of Canadian political commentariat with some of this brush, which is we are going in to a time of maximum conflict. And so the job of politicians and others in that time of uncertainty is social solidarity. Another word for that is patriotism. So, because what the job is to narrate the list of options, to narrate the situation, the danger of the situation, and steel the electorate for the future, and make sure that we have social cohesion for what is to come. And that is the piece that I haven't heard from corporate Canada. I haven't heard it sufficiently from any politician on any side. We are starting to hear it from people like Doug Ford, from Wab Kinew, from David Eby. We have heard glimmers of it, but it has not been cohesive from any table, any actor. And that is a real danger, because at the end of the day, this country has to stand for something.
It was interesting to hear that CIBC's head, their CEO, was also talking about this border czar issue, which was striking there. It's not just Danielle Smith making this call on the Shannon pushback on the appeasement talk. How about mollifying front? And so, but to your point, Shannon, there are, Canada's been talking about sort of on two tracks of response. They've been talking about retaliatory tariffs, much to Danielle Smith's chagrin, it seems. But they're also talking about this relief package, this sort of pandemic-style bailout. We had Dominic LeBlanc on our new feature, West of Center Shorts, with Rob Brown earlier this week, and he was talking about this. But Ken, you're the former Tory finance aide here. Can we afford a big bailout like that for sectors that are going to be affected?
Well, the reality of retaliatory tariffs is that they generate a ton of revenue. And if we put a 25% tariff on all of U.S. goods coming into Canada, that'll generate somewhere in the neighborhood of $100 billion of revenue, 100 to 150, depending on how elastic trade is. A bunch of economic terms, it don't matter. Let's just use 100 billion. That's a lot of money. You could get rid of the GST. I wrote a piece on this last week in the Hub. You could get rid of the GST, like all of it, for 50 billion. And you could double the GST credit to make sure poor people aren't hurt for another 10. And you could take the last 40 billion to do a wage subsidy for the auto sector, where people are predicting up to 40% layoffs for tariffs that are imposed on us, and then retaliatory tariffs going back. And so those are all short-term things that we can do. And it's like, imagine if we went into COVID and somehow revenue fell from the sky. That's sort of what's going to happen here if we do retaliatory tariffs. It actually generates a ton of revenue. And so we will be able to do this. We will have to do this in the short term. The bigger question is, to go back to my earlier rant, if these tariffs last forever, we can't just use these short-term things forever. We need to figure out some long-term solutions. But I think in the short term, the reason we do retaliatory tariffs is not just to hit back, but also because they generate the revenue we need to cushion the blow on Canadians and Canadian business.
It's probably worth reminding everybody, and myself, because we're, what's happening here, that last time Trump put tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, they lasted, about a year, I think? And he did use national security pretenses to do it without any specific demands. And we didn't do a lot on national security. We just renegotiated NAFTA into CUSMA and handled it that way. Okay, I want to move on now, because for the next part of the conversation, we're going to put Donald Trump's drill baby drill and we don't need our oil comments together with a bit of a reality check. And to do that, can't think of anybody really better to bring in than Jackie Forrest from the ARC Energy Research Institute. She and Peter Chertsakian, also with ARC Energy, produce an excellent Energy Ideas podcast. And I got to say, Jackie, every time I'm driving and listening to it or walking, I curse myself because I can't take notes. And I need to take notes when I'm listening to it because I learn so much. So thanks for coming on. Welcome to West of Center.
Yeah, thanks for the invite.
So a big part of Donald Trump's bluff or threat, call it what you will, comes from this assertion that Canada can be totally energy independent without Canada. Can they do without our, 4 million barrels a day?
Well, yes, we send 4 million barrels a day to them. But, there is some logic in terms of they do have enough oil. It's maybe not the right oil, but we send them 4 million barrels a day. And then they export about 4 million barrels a day off the Gulf of Mexico.
Well,
the Gulf of America, I guess.
Well, that sounds like easy arithmetic then.
Yeah, it's nice and easy. So, and actually, they're the world's largest producer of oil. They're at 13 million barrels a day. Saudi Arabia and Russia are under 10 million barrels a day right now, so by a long shot. And at 100 BCF per day, they're the world's largest producer of natural gas. So they do have a lot of oil. I can't deny that. The one thing we have going for ourselves is many of their refineries are not tooled up to take that light crude that they produce. And they've, especially in the Midwest and in the Gulf Coast, have spent billions and billions of dollars making their refineries take heavy oil. And so that's why they still take crude from us and export their light crude, because they have more light crude than their refineries really need. And so in the short term, yes, they do need our oil. But hey, in the long term, especially if our oil is $15 a barrel more, which was what a 25% tariff would be, I think there would be some motivation to adjust those refineries, but that would take some time. So in the short term, they certainly do need our oil. That doesn't mean, though, that we're not weak in this scenario, because oil prices at the margin, and if our oil is that much more expensive, and even if they need a little bit less, that can really result in us having lower demand for our product. And lower demand for your product in any industry usually means lower prices.
So how long would it take them to retool, if they wanted to go that way, to retool their refineries? Because you're right, that sounds like would be an adjustment for them.
That would take many years. I mean, honestly, they could run more light crude right away, except that they wouldn't be producing as much refined products. There's also a lot of pipelines that are built to take Canadian crude to the Midwest and then crude down the other way. So all those pipes would have to be reversed. So it would take many years. And so you'd have to see this as a structural, permanent situation. And actually, I don't think that would happen because I think we'll probably reduce our prices so they won't feel motivated to do that. They'll still take our crude oil, and a lot of the price of the tariff will be borne by Canadian producers because we don't have alternative markets to send our crude oil if they don't want it. Let's compare to Mexico. Tariffs on Mexico really doesn't impact them very much. Their crude oil is on tidewater. If the Americans don't want to pay them the global price, they'll go somewhere else. We don't have that option. We're captive. And so I think I don't think they'll retool. I think probably we'll just reduce our price so that they still want our oil.
But don't we send some of what TMX is producing just down the coastline to America too?
We do. And you know, the reason that is we send it to the tidewater and it goes to California because that's the closest market and the most efficient. Like, you don't want to send your crude halfway around the world. There's a lot of transportation costs in that. If you have a willing buyer, like right there. If tariffs come on, that will stop. We will start to see Canadian crude oil be going to Asia and farther afield because, you know, the California refineries are going to say, wow, that's just too expensive. I'd rather buy a crude from somewhere else that doesn't have a 15 or 25% tariff on it. And
this idea of drill, baby, drill, because that's talking about the kind of the longer structural things. I mean, you know, I don't think Trump believes that they can just turn on a switch and start drilling and producing a whole bunch more oil to displace what they need in America, what you know, serve America's needs. How realistic with deregulation and Trump declaring an energy emergency are they actually going to ramp up aggressively oil production in the States?
You know, in the near term, I think there are constraints. First of all, you know, it's not like Russia or Saudi Arabia where the government controls how much money goes into new investment, right? And most of these publicly traded oil companies in the U.S., their investors are saying, don't grow, give me my money back. So I think that's one constraint, how much CapEx will actually go into growing production. But certainly, you know, these executive orders like unleashing American energy and this declaring a national energy emergency, I think they could result over the next 4 years in more production than would have been otherwise. They're even talking about unlocking Alaska's extraordinary resource potential. That was the name of another one of the executive orders. So we know there's a lot of oil in ANWR and in Alaska. Now, will companies believe that these executive orders are going to hold and that they can develop these resources in the time they need without risk of things changing? I don't know. But certainly there's a lot of oil in Alaska. Natural gas, they have like 100 years of natural gas at their current consumption. The issue is they haven't been able to build pipelines out of regions like the Marcellus. So if this executive order about an emergency, which is basically giving wartime kind of measures in terms of expediting the build out of infrastructure, I think they could definitely produce a lot more gas. So, you know, I don't underestimate the Americans. I think 3-4 years from now, probably there will be more production than there would have been in the absence of all of these changes. But I do think the real constraint will be these public companies and how much capital they're really willing to deploy.
So how do Canadian oil and gas companies respond or brace for that potential big change, let alone what could happen? I don't know. Is it happened yet? No, we're fine. No tariffs yet. We're fine. We're still fine. How did Canadian companies respond?
Well, you know, I think the one thing we have going for us is that we do have these pipelines into major refining regions with refineries that have spent billions of dollars over decades to configure their refineries to take our crude. So I think our heavy crude oil is pretty safe. I think with natural gas, we should be developing more West Coast exports. We've got LNG Canada coming middle of this year. There's a potential for phase 2. We really should do that. And we should really move on getting more LNG exports off our West Coast because I do think our natural gas markets in the U.S. Are potentially going to get smaller here with these types of measures. And we should be doing the same thing for oil. We should be thinking about how to get the throughput even higher on the TMX and potentially other outlets to other markets. That is the one thing that can protect us. You know, I said that we have to absorb the price discount of these tariffs. If we had more, it doesn't have to be all of our product going overseas, just a bigger portion of it, it would enable us to have more market power and push more of this price discount back onto the American side of the border.
Because TMX has had a big difference on that.
It has, yes. TMX, in Canadian dollar terms, we have a bit weaker Canadian dollar and the TMX. If we didn't have tariffs, we expect Canadian oil prices would be about $10 higher this year between TMX and a bit weaker Canadian dollar. This would have been, and this will be, if we don't have tariffs, and I'm still hoping for that, a very good year for the Canadian oil and gas industry.
So you'd think, you know, kind of removed from a lot of things, that a protectionist industry, a domestic industry in America would want to keep other stuff out, to be more protectionism, notionally. But the American Petroleum Institute the big oil lobby there is saying, no, we don't want this because we're so integrated. Why are they not wanting protection for their own domestic industry and kind of cheering and hoping that Donald Trump exempts oil as he applies tariffs?
Well, this will hurt them too. I agree with Ken. I think generally it hurt us more, but it doesn't come without pain for them, especially for certain regions, like the Midwest refiners. We just heard from Valero yesterday that they're thinking they may have to cut their refining crude runs by around 10% because of a lack of heavy crude because of this situation. Not only us, but Mexico as well. So refineries are going to be not making a lot of money, running less crude, probably employing less people. There's also, I do believe this will increase gasoline prices. It'll vary by region, but overall there'll be higher gasoline prices than there would have been. I mean, if we take a step back, the reason that our systems are so highly integrated is because that was the most efficient, lowest cost way to deliver energy for people on both sides of the border. So if we start to add these barriers and distortions, it's going to make it more expensive for everyone.
And really quickly, what do you have a sense of what the gas price increase will be if in the States if they slap 25% on?
It's really varies by region, and it's really hard to get an exact number. I would estimate it's probably in the range of 50 to 50 cents a gallon, which, that seems like a lot. But if you go back in the last year, because oil price is so volatile, they've had gasoline prices that have been 30 or 50 cents higher. And also that will depend on the region.
I'm sorry, for a Canadian listener, that's comparable to what on a liter?
Oh my God! Do you want me to figure that out? Their price is kind of around $3 a gallon right now. Okay. So maybe it's about a 10% increase in the price of gasoline. I do know when you go to the pump, it varies by 10 or 15%. It seems every single time I fill up, and I'm not even sure why. So, I think there's a cost there. But I actually think the real pain will be felt more by the refiners in the U.S., and it's nice to see Valero, and I hope we're going to see other refiners speak up over the coming days on the damage this is going to do.
I apologize for the math on the fly question, Jackie, but let's bring Shannon and Ken back into it. What do you think all this drill baby drill and strategy means for Alberta's energy sector? Start with Shannon.
Well, last summer, Trump hosted a bunch of oil company CEOs at Mar-a-Lago and stood up in front of the media after that event and said, I just asked them for a bunch of money, and if they give me a bunch of money, I will do what they want. Literally, that was almost verbatim the quote. So, that's almost a countervailing force to what to drill baby drill, because they don't want a collapsing price. It's also a countervailing force for the refiners and those that are integrated with the Canadian operations here and the refinery operations, in particular in the Midwest. So they the status quo is better than whatever inconvenience or instability that would be introduced by a 25% tariff or a 10% tariff or anything in between, or any kind of supply disruption. So I think there's a little bit of a good news in Trump's essential grift that he was making plain for everyone last summer, and that will help Canadians a little bit. That integration of the industry across the border and the desire not to see the price collapse, quite frankly, because more supply will make that happen, is actually a good news for Canadians.
Ken, Trump on Thursday was saying, when asked about whether he'd apply a tariff on oil, said, well, we'll see where the price lands. How do I don't know, sorry, I have to laugh at some of it, but how do you interpret their approach on what they're doing on oil and tariffs and trade and drill and whatnot?
Look, like so much else that Trump threatens, does, doesn't do, pretends to do, actually does, I think the only thing that Canada can do is hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And so we should always ask ourselves, what is the worst possible outcome? And how do we respond to that worst possible outcome? Now, if that outcome doesn't happen, there's no harm in preparing for it. And it'll be good that he didn't do those things. And I think the worst possible outcome in this case is a 25% tariff on all of our oil. And we are even further constrained. Look, I said some mean things to Danielle Smith at the beginning of the podcast, so I'll say something nice now. She was on another podcast talking about how Western Canadian energy goes into the U.S. and how a lot of oil and gas goes into Ontario and Quebec from the U.S. And so we have to be a little bit careful. I'd like to ask your other guests how true that is, because sometimes Danielle stretches the truth. But I know Ontario and Quebec do import oil and gas from the United States. So if we're going to be doing stuff like I think the idea of turning off the taps, for example, is a dumb idea. A tariff might be a less dumb idea. But we have to remember that the U.S. also has leverage over some Canadian consumption of oil and gas into Ontario and Quebec. So I think Premier Ford should be a little careful about what he proposes to do in the event that these things happen. But I go back to my original point. I don't think we can take Trump at his word ever, because like I said earlier, I think he goes to bed sometimes surprised that the things he thought he was going to do in the morning aren't actually done, or things got done that he didn't think he would get to do. And so we need to hope for the best and prepare for the worst, because the worst is not beyond this president, and he doesn't let economic arguments or rational thinking affect what he wants to do and what he believes. No rational person would have thought this guy would have been president in 2017, and no rational person would have thought he would have won again now, but he did. And we have to, and he did by saying many crazy things. And so we have to prepare for the worst and hope that worst doesn't actually happen.
Shannon, I know you're happily an ex-politician, but if you were in government, would you do like Danielle Smith has done? And there's this leverage point question about Canada using oil if America exempts oil. Would you do like Danielle Smith is doing and warn gravely against using oil as a leverage, either as an export tax or curtailing?
None of Trump's threats are based in an economic reality. They would harm Canadian or American consumers, rather, and American companies, and he doesn't care. He is making those threats for reasons of negotiation. And so when the other side goes big, you need to counter it with something similar and be serious about it, not roll over and show him the soft underbelly. And that is my point of, around narrating this for the public, because there's kind of two audiences in the Canadian response. There's the people of Canada, who are going to have to steel themselves for some form of economic disruption. That is just a fact. And it is up to leaders to make sure that the public is ready for that, and that they understand that their leaders can lead them through it. So there's two audiences. There's that one. And then the other audience is, of course, the madman, right? The public and the madman. And so in what Danielle Smith has done is said, well, I've got the back of Alberta, but maybe not necessarily if that's traded off against the rest of the country, which is exposing a weakness to the opponent in this case. It is very bad game theory. It might make perfectly good sense as macroeconomics, but it's not good as game theory. And then she also needs to be essentially communicating or helping to communicate to the public what we're going to do to help people through this. And those are the two pieces that I have been watching for, not just from Danielle Smith, but from everyone across the board in terms of the politics of this, the Canadian national identity of all of this. Who are we as a country? That's the piece I'm not seeing come to the fore yet. I hope it does in our as yet notional federal election exercise that we're going into, because it is a perfect time to be having that conversation with Canadians.
Let's keep elections back off this. Jackie, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I understand, Shannon, what you're saying about the politics, but I do support Danielle Smith in that there are some real potential for energy shortages in Canada if they decide, for instance, let's say we curtail our exports and they decide to do the same back to us, because we don't have very many options either. So in Eastern Canada, we have about half of the natural gas being used in Quebec and Ontario coming from the U.S., so that would be a big problem if that got shut off. And oil, 100% dependent on Ontario and into Montreal on oil coming from through the U.S. We have refined product imports across this country, BC, Ontario, Quebec, where if they cut those refined product coming in, we wouldn't have enough gasoline for Canadian consumers. Not only would it create price issues, but actually have shortages. And electricity, people think of us as a net exporter to the U.S. Actually, that's been changing because our hydro generation has been lower the last several years. We're actually quite balanced. So if we start cutting our electricity to them, well, they're just as well could cut the electricity back to us. So because we're so highly integrated, there are big risks. And I think if we make these, if we retaliate this way, we have to expect that that's a potential. And be ready for that because we have some vulnerabilities.
I think it's
Well,
always...
there's no question we have vulnerabilities, and that is exactly why what needs to happen here is a coordinated approach, and an approach that holds back on what the worst could be, but maintains it as a threat. Mr. Trump is doing this. He is maintaining it as threats, not as action. Yet he is not engaging in these if-then scenarios and moving around in these sort of macroeconomic analysis. He's not doing any of that. He is using this as a negotiating tactic, and negotiations have to be met with negotiations. So, picking through the entrails of macroeconomic arguments, I am not sure in terms of what our leaders are doing. Our analysts can be doing one thing, but what our leaders should be doing is projecting strength and patriotism, and ensuring that we can protect Canadians and that we are willing to stand up for whatever this concept of a country is, and make sure that we are helping people through that economic disruption. That is what we should be hearing from actual leadership right now.
I feel like this is a case where threats are really neat and reality is really, really messy when any of these happen. And it's,
the reality is, because of our circumstances, we are the weaker party here, and we haven't done things that we should have done, like created more access for our products, not just oil and gas, but with other countries. And I hope this ignites a conversation in Canada about creating new markets for our products.
But we're in this bed. And is it still negotiation at this stage? Still? Okay. So we got time for one last question. We're recording Friday morning, mid-morning, and still in the tariffs. When people are listening to this, things may be very different. But on to the weekend, what are you going to be watching for? Let's start with you, Shannon.
In terms of the coming week?
Yeah, on the weekend and the week.
Well, I'm going to be watching for whatever Trump does. And to Ken's first point that he made, whether they are moving towards this as more of a negotiating cudgel, or if they are starting to essentially embed their approach to American fiscal policy and overall economic growth policy, that is to say, starting to move towards cutting taxes in favor of tariff revenue, that there be dragons for Canadians and all of the other American trading partners, in which case we are going to have to probably adjust some of what we do as soon as we get those indications that they want to rely on that revenue.
And there's no NFL, so what are you going to be watching for, Mr. Boessenkool?
I'm going to be watching for what Trump does as opposed to what he says. And I think one of the things Canada should look for is an opening to get this broader negotiation on the table as fast as possible, the broader USMCA. You mentioned earlier, Jason, that those tariffs on steel and aluminum sort of got folded into the negotiations around USMCA. And I suspect the sooner we get to a broader negotiation on these things, maybe we can find some solutions and find out what their actual intentions are. But in all of these things, I continue to say to anyone who listen, we have to hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And as we game this out, we always have to ask ourselves, what is the worst possible outcome? And what would our response be in the world of that worst possible outcome? Because I think the worst is possible. And I wish that wasn't true. But I fear that the worst is possible. And I fear that we're not as prepared for the worst as we could or should be.
Jackie, I'll let you be as optimistic or as pessimistic as you want to be after that one.
Well, I can't even guess what's going to happen this weekend, so I'll just be waiting to hear the news and take Ken's approach. Hope for the best, but I think we should be preparing for the worst.
The only thing that's certainty for me is I have symphony tickets tonight, and I hope to enjoy that without my phone on. Listen, thank you both all so much. Shannon Phillips, Ken Boessenkool, and Jackie Forrest. And I've been Jason Markusoff. I'm still Jason Markusoff with West of Center. Thanks all for tuning in.